Well, we should toast to such an event, Simon suggested, quickly retrieving 2 glasses and a bottle of wine from the locker. Yes, it wasn't easy, but Curtis, we work honestly, and we know how to negotiate too. So this is a well-deserved victory, he added. He himself still couldn't believe they had managed such a successful deal. Yes, Curtis sighed, looking at his deputy. Simon, there's one thing I can't understand. If they were ready to sign the contract from the beginning, why all the theatrics? Probably to their self-esteem in their own eyes, Simon sighed back. Some people don't work in a straightforward manner. They want you to grovel and beg. All of this is nonsense, of course, but it's just the way it is. Curtis Burns had been in medium-sized business for over 7 years. His factory produced a variety of garden tools with a decent product range that saw the scale of production increase annually. Everything went smoothly with small wholesalers, but dealing with large chain stores was a different story. Negotiations took months and required a lot of effort. The wealthier the people were, the more petty and capricious they became, making them difficult to deal with. To our professionalism, Simon raised his glass. Curtis, stop worrying, everything's fine. I'm sorry, I'm exhausted, sighed the director. I'll probably head home. Okay, agreed Simon. If anything urgent comes up, I'll call you. Curtis made his rounds through the workshops and after ensuring everything was in order, headed to his car. Claudia, are you home? The man called his wife. I'll be home early today. Curtis, my mother and I are downtown. We decided to stroll around the city, his wife replied. We'll see you tonight. Curtis glanced at the clock. It was just past 3. He sighed. He would have loved to forget about everything and spend the rest of the day with Claudia, but she was out again. As he drove into his yard, he noticed his gardener busy in mowing. Hi, the owner greeted. Everything going well? Mr. Burns, good afternoon. The elderly man smiled broadly. You're home early today? Yes, I need some rest, Curtis replied. Why are you still here? He glanced at his watch. Well, Mrs. Bell wasn't happy with how I mowed the lawns. She made me do it again. Don't take it personally, Curtis answered, strolling through the garden. She always causes trouble for everyone. Go home. I'll talk to her. The elderly man picked up his lawnmower and walked towards the utility house. Curtis watched him go. Sarah Bell had been a thorn in his side for years. His mother-in-law had never been easy to get along with. She always wanted things her way, with no consideration for others. Curtis brewed some aromatic tea and retired to his study. The house was quiet, with only the cook preparing dinner in the kitchen. How I wish to forget everything for a while, Curtis voiced aloud. I'm so exhausted. He rested his head on the table. However, his brief respite was interrupted by a knock on the door after about 5 minutes. Startled, Curtis hastily smoothed his dishevelled hair and said to come in. Mr. Burns, I forgot to ask what we should do with the fish you brought, the cook inquired anxiously. Mrs. Bell had a fit this morning. She asked us to dispose of it. Why? Curtis was perplexed. It's fresh. I caught it just yesterday. I know, the cook replied dryly, but she did say that the whole house now smells of fish. Roger, please cook that fish for dinner, Curtis asked. I would enjoy it immensely. As for Sarah, she can eat whatever she prefers. I don't mind. Around 7 o'clock, faint noises began to emanate from downstairs, eventually escalating into the shrill squawking of the mother-in-law. I told you to throw that stinking fish away, she shrieked. Now the whole house reeks of it. What's the matter? Curtis descended into the living room. What's wrong? I asked Roger to cook fish for dinner. Curtis, you know I can't stand the smell of fish. Sarah turned up her nose. I'm going to be sick. Yes, honey, you're really behaving like a child. His wife also looked at him unhappily. It's interesting when your mother orders fish in a restaurant, it's okay, Curtis grumbled. "But when I return from fishing, she can't wait to throw my fish away." "But she doesn't sit in the restaurant kitchen where the fish is fried," Claudia said with reproach. "Do you even care about my mum?" Curtis said nothing in response, realizing that he would have his dinner with the cook in the kitchen. "Roger, thank you from the bottom of my heart," he said 30 minutes later after finishing his meal. "The fish is so delicious." After chatting with the man a little more, Curtis went up to his room, peeking into his wife's room on the way. He didn't understand how it happened, but he and his wife now had separate sleeping rooms. It was just that Claudia had insisted on it over time, saying that she couldn't sleep at all if someone else was sleeping in the room. "Claudia, how are you?" Curtis asked. "What have you been doing today?" He attempted to hug his wife, but she pulled away. "You don't love my mum," she pouted. "You're always yelling at her." "Are you serious?" the husband interjected in amazement. "Claudia, what are you saying? When have I ever yelled at her?" Instead of an answer, the woman remained silent, and Curtis, after waiting a little while, retreated to his room. "Is this a normal family life?" he muttered to himself. "She has got her own room, I have mine. Sometimes I think it would have been better if I hadn't gotten married." The man lay in bed and closed his eyes, reminiscing his past. Curtis Burns stood in the centre of a large hall. The presentation had ended, and he was in discussion with a businessman who ran 3 garden stores and was interested in small wholesale purchases. "Yes, I'm satisfied with your terms," the businessman said, "so I'll drop by next week with my assistant." On a Wednesday, a familiar man appeared in Curtis's office, accompanied by a striking woman. "Mr. Burns, this is Claudia, my assistant," the entrepreneur introduced. Throughout the contract discussion, Curtis found his gaze returning to Claudia, though she seemed not to notice. "Well, I suggest we finish our meeting with lunch at a nice place," Curtis said when the business was concluded. The entrepreneur agreed, and they all headed to the nearest restaurant. After lunch, Curtis became even more interested in Claudia, and to his delight, a few days later, the businessman sent her to Curtis with documents, and Curtis seized this chance to get to know the woman better. "May I invite you to lunch?" Curtis asked shyly. "Please don't refuse me." However, Claudia declined, explaining she had to return to work. "What about the weekend?" Curtis asked, looking her squarely in the eye. "We won't talk business, just a friendly meeting." Claudia hesitated. What was in her head, Curtis did not know, but she, to his delight, still agreed. At their meeting in the cafe on the weekend, Curtis asked her what she does besides work. "I won't lie, work consumes all my time," Claudia sighed. "I live with my sick mother. I need to work hard to support us both." "What's wrong with her?" Curtis inquired. "Is it something serious? Is she in the hospital?" "She has a thyroid problem," Claudia replied. "She relies on medication, which is expensive." "I'm sorry." Curtis sighed. "Claudia, is there anything I can do to help?" "What could you possibly help me with?" she retorted, with a hint of irritation in her voice. "If I could find a better-paying job, I would have left my secretary position long ago. Not only is the pay low, it drains my energy." "I understand," Curtis sighed. "Generally, there is no such thing as a perfect job. Problems exist everywhere." After meeting Claudia, Curtis pondered about how to help her and considered offering her a position in his company. However, things didn't go that way. Following their initial encounter, they had more meetings, but before he knew it, Curtis found himself falling for Claudia. He wondered what drew him to her. Was it her efficiency, or perhaps her distant demeanour? She wasn't flirting with him, hinting at anything, or seeming to care. Nonetheless, after 2 months of dating, Curtis confessed his love for her. Claudia was extremely flustered and didn't respond immediately, asking him to wait instead. For 2 weeks, Curtis was in agony. When Sarah eventually called to say yes, he felt like the happiest man on earth. "Curtis, but you need to meet my mum," Claudia said afterward. "I've already told her that we're in a serious relationship." "I don't mind," he agreed. "Let me invite both of you to my place for dinner. I'll arrange everything. It will be better than the most expensive restaurant." Curtis was very worried, understanding that his life probably depended on this meeting. However, he didn't like Sarah from their first meeting. She behaved arrogantly and slyly. "Curtis, what a terrific house you have!" Sarah looked around enthusiastically. "You can be envied. Not like me and Claudia living in a one-room apartment. If I could work, we might be able to buy a house, but my poor girl has to work so hard to provide for us." As for Claudia, she remained silent for most of the evening. It seemed to Curtis that she was thinking about something. "Claudia, is there something wrong with you?" he asked finally, unable to keep his anxiety. "You look very preoccupied." "Yes, I've had some difficulties at work. There's a paperwork issue to be resolved," she said calmly. "I'm sorry. I want so much to forget about everything, but nothing works." "Yes, work takes up a lot of time and energy. That's why I decided a long time ago that my wife will not work," Curtis said. "That's very commendable," Claudia's mother said. "Only truly loving husbands can respect their wives like that." Claudia blushed, but after this meeting, Curtis decided for himself that she would become his wife. Their wedding was held with great fanfare. On the bride's side was only her mother and a few friends. After the wedding, Claudia and her mother moved to Curtis. Curtis immediately asked his wife not to work, and initially it caused many disagreements. "Curtis, I can't just stay within these four walls," Claudia protested. "If you don't want me to work, at least let me volunteer." "And do what? Deliver food to the poor?" Curtis questioned. "There are many things one can do," she objected. "I could organize holidays for sick children, buy them gifts, clothes. I could even sponsor a few families and offer them support." "If that's what you want," Curtis conceded, "then fine. Just tell me how much money you'll need each month." "I've already worked it out," replied Claudia, and Curtis looked at her bewildered. "What did you expect?" she asked, noticing his surprise. "Stores aren't going to give me anything for free." "All right," the man sighed. "If it makes you happy, we'll do it." Claudia, overjoyed, hugged him tightly. Thus, she started a small charity foundation and spent most of her days working, rarely being home. The first few months, Curtis just flew from happiness, but then Sarah took household chores in her hands, and in the house you could constantly hear her disgruntled voice. Curtis tried to talk to her, but she immediately became ill, and after that Claudia arranged a scandal for Curtis. "Curtis, you know she has thyroid problems," his wife scolded. "She has an unstable emotional background, so she sometimes loses her temper. But she doesn't scream like crazy. She just makes remarks to the servants." And for a year, Curtis let it all happen. But then once, the mother-in-law fired the maid over a fault known only to her. Curtis sighed but didn't intervene. 3 days later, he was in his study when he heard voices downstairs. Sarah was speaking unpleasantly to a stranger, a woman who looked around 27 to 30 years old. "If you are not ready to stay after work and correct your mistakes," Curtis heard, "then you are not suitable for us." "I treat my work diligently. I know my job and I have experience. Why do you think I will be bad at cleaning?" the woman timidly replied. "Because for the salary I offer, everything should be beyond perfect," Sarah said angrily and gestured for the guest to leave the house. The woman hesitated for a few seconds, clutching her bag, then headed for the front door. "Wait a minute. You're hired," Curtis said loudly, and staring intently at his mother-in-law, added, "I am the master here." Sarah wanted to object, but fear held her back. Her face reddened as anger surged within her. "There will be no overtime work for you," Curtis reassured the poor woman. "Even if you make mistakes, it's no big deal. I won't keep you working late." "Curtis, can't you see this person is not right for us?" the mother-in-law finally blurted out. "I'm better at housekeeping than you are." Ignoring his mother-in-law, Curtis asked the guest, "What's your name?" "Abby," the woman replied timidly. "I have references. I've worked as a maid for 3 years." "If you're ready, you can start today," Curtis stated calmly before leaving the room. Sarah glared at Abby with such hatred that the woman shuddered. "Abby," the cook advised her that day, "our boss is a good man. His mother-in-law is difficult, but if he hired you personally, you have nothing to fear." The next day, Sarah gestured around the room arrogantly and said, "Yesterday you cleaned the living room poorly." Abby looked at her in bewilderment. That day, Sarah followed her around, trying to wear her out so she wouldn't return to work the next day. Of course, such thoughts had already begun to creep into Abby's mind, but this morning, just before her meeting with Sarah, she had bumped into Curtis in the hallway, and he'd given her the strength to continue her work in peace. "Abby, don't worry about what Sarah wants," Curtis had advised before leaving. "I hired you, so I'm responsible for you. Don't be afraid of her." During lunch, the landlady deliberately spilled tea on the carpet and threw a tantrum. "This stain wasn't here 10 minutes ago. You did it now," Abby responded calmly. "How dare you accuse me?" Sarah shouted. "You're nobody here." Abby didn't respond. Instead, she began to clean the stain while the woman continued to yell. Almost 2 years have passed, and Sarah hasn't been able to dismiss anyone since that incident. Meanwhile, Curtis felt a tinge of embarrassment over his inner discontent. He enjoyed all the privileges one could only dream of. Moreover, Claudia proved to be very calm and intelligent. She seldom argued with him. Curtis frequently took her to various gatherings and often heard complimentary remarks about her. "Mr. Burns, your wife is divine. For such a woman, any man would move mountains," a partner once remarked. But Claudia never gave Curtis any reason to doubt her. Their only disagreements arose due to her mother. But Curtis eventually stopped paying attention to that too. The only concern he had was the absence of children. "Curtis, don't panic. It's just not the right time yet," his wife used to assure him once. In such thoughts, Curtis eventually fell into a restless sleep, tossing and turning, repeatedly waking up. "When will I finally get some sleep?" he grumbled as he got up in the morning. It was one of the rare days they had breakfast together as a family, because normally Claudia was usually still asleep when her husband left for work. "How about we go out this weekend?" Curtis suggested. "It's been a while since we had a day out." "Sure," Claudia agreed. "Let's try go-karting. I've been a few times and really enjoyed it." "You want to go go-karting? Well, I don't mind. Sarah, will you join us?" "God forbid," his mother-in-law refused, waving her hands dismissively. "Don't even try to persuade me." "All right then, it's just the two of us. We'll race each other," Claudia laughed. Curtis eagerly awaited their trip to the go-kart track. Claudia asked him to rent the entire track for an hour to avoid any interruptions, and Curtis agreed with pleasure. As they drove out of town in the warm September weather, both were filled with anticipation and rubbed their hands together in excitement. "And what prize do I get if I beat you?" Curtis asked, his eyes sparkling. "Will you fulfill any of my requests?" "All right," Claudia responded coquettishly. "But first, try to beat me. I'm confident you won't be able to." Upon arriving, Curtis parked their car and joined his wife in heading towards the empty kart track. Shortly after, a sturdy young man approached them. "This one's for you, Mr. Burns." He gestured towards one of the racing carts. "And this pink one is for your wife." Curtis quickly jumped into his cart, responding, "Watch what I'm about to do. I will definitely beat you." Claudia and Curtis started their cars simultaneously, with Curtis giving Claudia a slight head start. Claudia took her time, not wanting to drive at full speed. They completed a few laps in this manner before Curtis began to accelerate, eventually catching up with Claudia and overtaking her on a turn. Claudia attempted to regain her lead. Curtis himself didn't realise what happened next. He only felt that the cart had stopped obeying him, and after a moment he felt a somersault, then another. Then the cart crashed into the tyres and pushed them forward. Everything was spinning before Curtis's eyes. He tried to exit the car, but found himself unable to move. He could hear voices around him. Everything blurred before he lost consciousness. 20 minutes later, an ambulance arrived, and he was taken to the hospital. His wife was fussing with the doctors, crying, asking them something. "Will he live?" Curtis heard someone's question. He himself was unable to open his eyes. His body felt lifeless. "I don't know yet," replied a doctor. "We're doing everything we can." Curtis had a vague recollection of what happened next. He would drift in and out of consciousness, hearing murmurs of voices nearby. "He overcorrected and lost control," Claudia's voice echoed. 3 days later. 3 days later, Curtis finally regained consciousness. He was alone. He moved his lips, calling out. A woman in a white robe approached. "What happened to me?" he asked the doctor, struggling. "My wife and I were go-karting." "Sadly, you had a crash," the doctor replied. "It's rare, but you were lucky. It could have been fatal." "When can I leave? I want to stand up," Curtis asked. "I think I can't feel my legs." "Regrettably, your spine is severely damaged." The doctor sighed. "It's unlikely you'll be able to walk. Be thankful you're still alive. None of us could offer any guarantees at the start." Curtis remained silent, gazing pleadingly at the doctor as tears streamed down his cheeks. In the evening, Claudia arrived, already aware of his situation, and crying incessantly. "Forgive me, Curtis. It's all my fault," she sobbed. "Why did I suggest we go there? I ruined you." "Claudia, it's not your fault," her husband reassured her. "I was the one who stepped on the gas. It was all my fault." Claudia, however, was inconsolable, appearing on the verge of hysteria. Curtis felt uncomfortable. He didn't want to see anyone, and Claudia's hysterics either. Meanwhile, Curtis gathered all his will in a fist and ordered himself to live on. While still in the hospital, he resumed work. His deputy Simon visited him, and they discussed as many work points as possible. Curtis was discharged from the hospital after 2 months and began a new chapter in his life. He was not planning to leave his job. He hired a reliable driver to transport him to the factory. Working from a wheelchair was challenging, but Curtis persevered. The office was equipped with ramps for him to navigate independently in his wheelchair. An assistant was always present to help with his daily tasks. Curtis despised being pitied and was deeply hurt by sympathetic looks. "Simon," he once told to his deputy, "I am not a defenceless creature. I will cope. I will never quit my work." Changes were also happening at Curtis's home. His wife began to distance herself. "Curtis, I closed my foundation," she once told him. "Let's try to go abroad for rehabilitation." "Claudia, it won't help me," he replied. "I'll never walk again, and we just need to learn to live with it." His mother-in-law became increasingly quiet around him. It seemed that neither his wife nor his mother-in-law knew what to do next. "Abby," he once asked his maid, "I need your help during the day. I can't go to work every day, so I need a reliable person at home. You've been with us for years, and I trust you completely. I'll find someone else for the cleaning." "All right, Mr. Burns," the woman smiled. "Just explain what I need to do." "Soon my house will be fully wheelchair accessible, and then I will require an attendant and an assistant," Curtis explained. The responsibilities are the same as any care for a man in a wheelchair. I'm sorry, but I can't ask anyone else for this job." The woman agreed and immediately started her new duties. "Abby, why haven't you vacuumed the living room yet?" Sarah complained when the ex-maid descended from the second floor. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Burns hired me as his assistant," Abby replied calmly. "I don't work as a cleaner anymore," she added, blushing. "You've been such a headache," Sarah hissed like a snake. "I would have fired you long ago." Abby did not respond, instead heading to the kitchen to make tea for her employer, while Curtis's mother-in-law watched her with a disgruntled look, deep in thought. Several months passed since the accident, and Curtis began to notice that his wife was becoming distant. Although she had closed her foundation, she continued to sponsor several families and spent her evenings working. "Claudia, you and I haven't talked in a long time," Curtis said to her one evening. "Did something happen to you?" "Curtis, I still can't forgive myself," she cried. "When I look at you, I don't want to live." "Claudia, honey, you should be happy that I'm alive." Curtis smiled gently. "Well, come to me. I missed you so much." He took her hand and went to his room. The woman kissed her husband without much enthusiasm, and Curtis felt it. It made him feel even more painful, and he told himself that he would no longer insist on their intimacy. But deep down, he wished that Claudia's love would not only not fade because he was confined to a wheelchair, but would also flare up with renewed vigour. Curtis himself did not understand where he got such moral strength. Instead of sobbing, he smiled. When he had a strong desire inside him to give up everything and end his life, he would take up some new endeavour. "Abby, why don't we take a trip to some museum?" Curtis once suggested to his helper. "You'll laugh, but I want to go to the Paleontological Museum." "All right," Abby smiled with enthusiasm. "Frankly speaking, I've never been there." "That's it. Now we definitely need to go there," smiled the man. "I'm sure you'll love it there." On Saturday, the driver took Curtis and his assistant to the museum. Despite it being a weekend, the museum was not crowded. Most people seemed eager to enter the dinosaur hall. Upon seeing Abby's surprised face, Curtis laughed and asked, "What do you think? Look at that giant." "Frankly, I'm relieved we weren't around during their time," responded Abby, her lips pale. "If I had seen it in person, I might have gone mad." "Well, not all of them were predators," Curtis countered. "Many were herbivores. We could have ended up in their stomachs like unnoticed bugs on vegetable leaves. But I don't think they would have preyed on us." There were vast forests. They had plenty of food. For nearly 3 hours they examined the museum's most fascinating exhibits, with Curtis providing commentary throughout. Later, on the way home, the man exclaimed, "What a fantastic day off! It may sound odd, but only when I was confined to a wheelchair did I truly start to value life, each moment of it. Now I'm less fearful of losing anything." Abby smiled, reflecting on her simple life. She lived in a rented apartment and her paycheck was divided in half, one part for her parents and the other for her own expenses. In essence, she had nothing to lose. Meanwhile, they arrived home in high spirits. Claudia was already home and Curtis approached his wife. "Honey, I'd like to invite you to a romantic dinner." Saying this, he got slightly anxious because Claudia looked at him in surprise, awaiting further explanation. "I'm going to get us a suite in a classy hotel and organise a romantic evening for us," Curtis said with hope in his voice. "I just thought it would be nice to spend the evening outside our home." "All right," Claudia smiled. "Let's consider it a date. I'll come to the hotel and you'll wait for me there." "With flowers?" Curtis took his wife's hand. "I love you. I promise you won't regret it." Curtis spent most of the night worrying. He was filled with anticipation because he had waited too long for Claudia to finally accept what had happened and return her love to him. "I'll order a huge bouquet of red roses," Curtis planned. "We'll have champagne and fruit brought to our room." Towards morning he fell asleep and dreamed of Claudia holding roses. He woke up around 11 o'clock. He rang the bell and Abby entered his room. She noticed Curtis's worried look and asked anxiously, "Is something wrong? May I help you?" "Yes," Curtis replied immediately. "Abby, please order a huge bouquet of red roses and prepare some clothes for going to the restaurant." "Are we going somewhere today? Do you have an appointment?" the woman asked, smiling. "I have a romantic dinner with my wife tonight," Curtis said cheerfully. "Abby, can I ask you one more thing? I let my driver go today. Could you take a cab with me to the hotel? And from there, I'll come with Claudia." "Of course I'll come with you," Abby agreed. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." However, Curtis was very nervous and restless. At 6 p.m. he and Abby took a cab. He agreed with his wife that he would go to the hotel early and wait for her there. She was expected to arrive by 8 o'clock. In the room, Abby helped Curtis settle in, put the flowers in water, and ensured everything was in order. She bid her host goodbye and left. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Burns," she said before leaving. The woman came out of the large, beautiful hotel building and looked up. Somewhere there was Curtis. Right in front of the hotel was a small cafe, and Abby decided to have a cup of tea. She savoured her favourite custard cakes with cream, when suddenly she noticed Claudia's car parked 300 metres from the hotel. At this moment, Claudia herself and an unknown man stepped out, and after a brief conversation, she kissed the stranger. Abby, taken aback, watched as another car pulled up, and the man got in. Claudia waved in the direction of the car and then headed into the hotel. Who was that? Abby's heart pounded. Judging by that kiss, he wasn't just a friend. Confused and concerned, Abby's thoughts turned to Curtis. He was a kind man who never harmed anyone, and she felt an obligation to protect him. A sense of impending trouble loomed over her. The cafe was open until 3 a.m., and Abby ended up drinking about 10 mugs of tea throughout the night. She struggled to stay awake despite her exhaustion. Her intuition of danger kept her alert. Almost at 3 o'clock in the morning, she saw as Claudia hurriedly left the hotel, got into her car and drove off. And where is Curtis? The caregiver couldn't help but wonder. As she began to gather her items, the hotel's front door opened and the guard assisted Curtis in exiting onto the street. Abby sighed with relief. She was hastily dressing as she walked when, just a few meters from the exit from the cafe, she saw a car swiftly pull up to the hotel. 2 men jumped out, quickly bundled Curtis into the car, and drove away. "Stop!" Abby shouted after the departing car, but it was too far away and it was quite dark outside. "What am I going to do?" she said to herself, almost crying out of helplessness. At this moment, a taxi pulled up to the hotel, and Abby immediately rushed towards it. "Please, let's go," she implored. "I'll pay double the fare." The driver was initially reluctant, but acquiesced when he heard the amount she offered. "We need to find a black jeep," Abby instructed. "Let's head towards the highway. I'm sure they've left town." Her intuition did not fail her, and very soon they spotted a familiar car. Abby asked the driver to keep a distance. They drove for approximately an hour, and then the jeep veered off the road. "There's a forest there," the taxi driver responded to her request to follow the jeep. "There's no road, just a dirt path." Abby was uncertain of what frightened her more, the darkness and wolves, or the possibility of finding her employer dead. Handing over the fare, she hurried into the forest. She crept carefully behind the first rows of trees until she reached the dirt road where the black Land Rover had turned off. She hid inside huge bushes, and 20 minutes later she saw the car return to the road and head back towards the town. Who are these people? What have they done to him? Abby cautiously navigated through the bushes. Her legs trembled as the sound of howling wolves filled the air, but an inner certainty that Curtis was alive propelled her forward, despite her fear. "Lord, help me," Abby whispered. "Please, help me find him." "Curtis! Curtis!" she called out as loud as she could. "Curtis, where are you?" But there was only silence in return. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she received no response. She began peering into the bushes when she noticed one area where the branches were bent to the ground. With trembling legs, she moved in that direction, while the howling of wolves grew louder. "Curtis!" she shouted at the top of her voice. "Where are you? Please answer me." After about 5 minutes, she reached a small clearing. The area was brighter and she could see the clear outlines of trees. Something was lying near one of them. "Curtis!" she cried out and rushed forward. "Please hang on, I'm coming," she urged, clutching at the branches of the bushes for support. She crawled to a wheelchair, near which a man was lying. He was staring upwards with unseeing eyes. Instinctively, she pulled out her cell phone. Initially, Abby wanted to call the police and an ambulance. Additionally, she needed to inform his wife. "I don't even know where we are, so I need to take him to the hospital first." Abby struggled to her feet, and after some effort she succeeded. She placed Curtis on her cloak and dragged him to the highway, where she hailed a car. The driver assisted in loading Curtis into the car and drove them to the nearest hospital. The doctor immediately examined Curtis. Though there were no visible signs of violence, his weak heart rhythm indicated that he had been drugged. Miraculously, Curtis survived, regaining consciousness 3 days later. During these days, Abby was anxious. It was odd that none of Curtis's relatives had contacted her, so she called the cook. "Abby, none of the owners are home. 3 days ago Mrs. Bell got sick and was taken to some private clinic, and Claudia's been with her ever since. I don't know where Mr. Burns is, and they gave me a week off." After hanging up the phone, Abby realised she would have to wait for Curtis to come to his senses and start communicating properly. Then, perhaps, things would become clearer. "Abby, what are you doing here? Where am I?" Curtis asked, looking around. "Am I in the hospital?" "Yes, Mr. Burns. What happened to you?" She looked intently into his eyes. "Do you remember being kidnapped?" Bewildered, Curtis looked at Abby as if he was trying to rewind time. When he finally remembered, he shuddered. "Abby, I left the hotel and was waiting for a cab, and then someone pulled me into a car. I felt a prick, and everything after that was like a dream," Curtis said, his face covered in sweat. "Have you seen these people?" Abby asked quietly, attempting not to attract attention. "Do you know them?" "No," Curtis replied thoughtfully, turning pale. "I believe they intended to kill me." "I found you in the forest," Abby began. "There were wolves present. It's possible they planned for the wolves to maul you in a few days, ensuring nobody would ever discover how you ended up there." "Abby, how did you find me?" Curtis asked, astonished. Only now was he beginning to grasp the meaning of her words. "I'm sorry, but I followed you," Abby admitted, lowering her head. "After leaving the hotel, I decided to have tea in the cafe across the street. I was very tired that day, but when I saw your wife arrive, and not alone, I feared for you." "Not alone? What do you mean?" He stared intently into Abby's eyes. "I won't lie. There was a man with her. I didn't see his face," the woman replied, "but I can assure you they were kissing. Then a car pulled up and the man got in." "Abby, are you sure?" Curtis said, horrified. "Maybe you imagined the whole thing. You see," he lowered his eyes bashfully, "my wife and I had a wonderful romantic evening. We planned to return home in the morning, but my mother-in-law called at 4 o'clock saying she was literally dying. Claudia left me right away to go straight home, not to lose time with me. I had to call a cab and come back myself. You know the rest." Abby sighed and told her boss what she had learned from his cook. "I think someone intended to kill you," the woman said, taking his hand. "Mr. Burns, it's dangerous for you to return home now. Let it go the way it's going. We should keep it a secret that you're alive for a while and see how things develop. Someone's bound to give themselves away, otherwise they'll find you, and this time they might not spare your life." "Oh my goodness, I can't understand why," Curtis murmured. "I haven't wronged anyone. Why would they want to kill me? And in such a gruesome way? That's absurd." "Mr. Burns, were you aware that Claudia was seeing someone?" Abby suddenly asked. "Abby, I apologize, but I still believe you're mistaken." The man scrutinized her. "Just because she had a man in her car doesn't imply anything. Claudia interacts with people regularly, but the idea that she kissed him, I'm convinced that's just your imagination." The woman looked at him and didn't respond. She understood that without solid evidence, she wouldn't be able to convince him of anything. "Mr. Burns, you'll be discharged in a few days, and you need to lay low." "But where?" The man pondered. "I may rent a place to stay for a couple of months if you'll assist me with that. Take the credit card in my wallet. I'll give you the PIN. Please find the apartment for me." "Don't worry, I won't leave you," the woman smiled. "Take my old phone. It's risky to call from yours in case it's been compromised. If you encounter any problems, call me immediately. My new number is saved there." Curtis looked at her in surprise. Despite everything he had experienced, he still couldn't fathom that this wasn't all some elaborate prank, and he was genuinely in danger. After Abby departed, Curtis became lost in his thoughts. He mentally reviewed all his partners and competitors, wondering who could have betrayed him. However, none of them seemed to care about his fate. His suspicion then shifted towards his subordinates. Could Simon have done this? A thought popped into Curtis's head. We've worked together for years. He's reliable. I can't see into his soul, though. Even if I entertain the idea that he did it, what's his motive? To take over the factory? Curtis tiredly rubbed his temples. His head was spinning, but he needed to continue this internal investigation. Okay, let's consider Claudia and her mother. Curtis sighed. They've lived comfortably, spending money without a care. What are they missing? They had everything. Does Claudia have a secret lover? After the passionate night we spent at the hotel, I doubt it. Perhaps Abby saw someone she recognized kissing Claudia on the cheek, especially since it was already dark. Regardless, I miss her dearly. That was the most passionate night of our marriage. I finally understood how much Claudia loves me. She must be worried sick about me. How do I let her know I'm okay? I bet she has already tried calling me hundreds of times. Curtis was conflicted. He took the phone that Abby had left him and was about to call when he decided against it. Love, I'm fine, don't worry, he texted. A minute later, his phone rang. Despite Claudia's multiple attempts to reach him, he resisted answering. Then a message from her arrived. Curtis, I'm losing my mind from worries. I was going to go to the police. His wife texted. You don't need to involve the police. I'll find you when everything is settled. He texted back. Claudia tried to call Curtis again, but he still didn't answer. The next day, Abby quickly found suitable lodging, paid the landlady, and headed straight to the hospital with the keys. She came into the ward and noticed that Curtis was awake now. Abby, I believe the only one who could have done this is Simon, my deputy. Curtis whispered, but I can't fathom his motive. Mr. Burns, let's not jump to conclusions. Abby replied in a matter-of-fact tone. Tomorrow I'll pick you up and we'll move to your new apartment. We'll have to buy you some new clothes. I'll also pick up a new wheelchair. I've already arranged for that. Abby, thank you, Curtis said, his eyes filling with tears. You've saved me more than once. It'll be okay, she reassured him, gently stroking his head. "The important thing is that no one knows where you are right now. I believe we'll have some leads soon." "Shouldn't we report this to the police? At least they can protect me," her man offered. "I wouldn't get my hopes up," the woman replied coldly. "You can bribe anyone these days, there's no guarantee." "Nevertheless, I can't understand who I could have offended," Curtis sighed. "I've never wronged anyone, cheated, or had an affair with another man's wife. Why would anyone be mad at me?" Late that night, Abby returned to her apartment and collapsed onto the bed. She didn't sleep for long, though. Her alarm clock rang at 8, and she began to prepare for the day. She bought food and necessary items for Curtis. By noon, she got him to his temporary dwelling. "Well, this is our new home," Abby said as she navigated the wheelchair into the apartment. "It's a good place with thresholds, so you can move around easily. Just don't go too fast," she joked. "I once lived life in the fast lane at my wonderful big house, and now I'm in a wheelchair in a tiny apartment." Curtis sighed. "Abby, thank you. I can't express how grateful I am. When this is all over, you'll take me to a museum." She laughed. "I've always enjoyed those outings with you." "I promise," Curtis replied with a broad smile. "We'll visit the most fascinating museums." Abby prepared dinner, and after enjoying the meal, she helped Curtis get settled in bed. She then retreated to the couch. "Finally I can sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps," she thought before drifting off. The following day, Curtis asked Abby to visit his factory. He had a reliable person there who could tell him about the real situation there. Without hesitation, Abby left her boss for his errands. At the gatehouse, Abby gave the guard the reliable person's name, and soon an elderly man appeared. Abby ushered him aside, explaining she represented Mr. Burns, and asked about the last factory happenings. "Nothing unusual," the man replied, bewildered. "Everything at the factory is calm. Work continues as usual." "Is your deputy trustworthy?" Abby asked cautiously. "Simon?" The man seemed surprised. "I've worked for Mr. Burns for many years and never had any issues with his deputy. He's a good man." Abby exhausted her questions for this man, and asking him to keep their conversation confidential for now, she went home. Meanwhile, Curtis was alone, his mind in turmoil. Torn between reporting to the police immediately and waiting a bit longer, he found himself fiddling with Abby's phone, and eventually he gave in to his secret desire. "Claudia, my love," he dialed his wife. "I want you to know that I'm okay. I've missed you so much." "Curtis, where are you?" An agitated voice responded immediately. "I've almost lost my mum, and now I don't even know where you are." "You see, someone wanted to kill me," Curtis said. "That's why I'm forced to hide for now. I suspect Simon." "Kill you?" Claudia's voice trembled. "You know, a few days ago a man called us on your behalf and said that you were away for a week or two, that you would call afterward. That's why I was calm and spent all those days with my mum without worrying about you. And why did I leave you that night? I should have waited for you, and we could have gone home together. It's my fault again. I'm begging you, please tell me where you are. I promise no one will ever know. I'll only come to see you for a few minutes." Curtis felt so painful that he couldn't stand it and told Claudia his address. After his conversation, he dialed up to Abby and asked her to watch Simon for a while. In fact, he just didn't want her to discover that he revealed his new place to his wife. All these days, Curtis missed Claudia deeply, constantly reminiscing their last evening together. He felt his love for his wife intensify, causing his body to tremble in anticipation of their reunion. Curtis was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. He went to answer it and was met by two men who rushed into the apartment. One of them injected something into Curtis's arm, causing him to lose consciousness almost instantly, and then they swiftly carried him out like a piece of furniture. Abby had been waiting outside the factory for 4 hours. She was freezing, but Simon never came out. Exhausted, she dialed Curtis's number, but he didn't answer. After about 10 minutes, she tried calling him again. Abby grew concerned and hailed a taxi. She needed to get home quickly. The closer Abby got to the house, the more her anxiety grew. She paid the taxi driver and sprinted towards the elevator. She rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. Standing rooted to the spot, she instinctively tried the door handle and found it open. With shaky legs, she entered the apartment. Curtis was nowhere to be found. The woman quickly grabbed her phone, intending to call the police. However, she decided against it and headed to her boss's house. "I'm sure Claudia's involved in this. If they killed him, they're probably trying to hide the evidence now," Abby reasoned. "While I'm telling the police, they might just sweep everything under the rug, and the guilty party will never be found." It was already dark, but Abby saw very well what was happening in Claudia's bedroom because the curtains there were left open, revealing a distinct male silhouette. "That's definitely not Curtis," Abby whispered to herself. "Who could be in her room? Given that the kitchen light is off, it seems none of the workers are present." Gradually, some pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but she still couldn't understand who the main villain in this story was. The woman called a cab, paid the driver for the night, and prepared to wait. At 3 o'clock, a car with Claudia and that strange man left Curtis's house. The cab driver and Abby followed them. Soon, Claudia stopped at some bridge and with her passenger got into an old rusty car that was parked there. That car drove towards the suburbs, and Abby and the cab driver followed it. Abby understood the danger of her surveillance, but she felt she had to take the risk again. However, she was so tense that she didn't even realize where they had gone. After probably 30 minutes, the driver dropped Abby off on a deserted street. He was too scared to continue. Abby wandered the dark streets, straining to hear the car. She felt an overwhelming fear that made her body tremble. The barking of dogs echoed in the distance. Eventually, she found herself at the edge of the suburb. Suddenly, a car's headlights flashed on near the outermost house. Quickly, Abby hid behind the end of a brick wall, and the same old car drove by her. "He must be there," she whispered to herself. "But what do I do now? If they've brought Curtis here, there might be someone guarding him. They might even kill me too." And finally she called the police. The policeman listened reluctantly, promising that someone would come. The woman wrapped herself in her demi-seasonal raincoat and waited. An hour passed, then 2, but no one came. As dawn broke, Abby called the police again. The same disgruntled voice curtly informed her that the police had almost arrived on the scene. Cautiously, Abby started towards the house. It was eerily quiet and the surrounding houses appeared uninhabited. As she approached the gate, a large dog lunged at her. She was fortunate that it was on a chain. Startled, Abby decided to wait for the police. Cold shivers racked her body, and to warm up she began to move around, which provoked the dog further. It pulled at its chain with such force that Abby feared it would break loose. Finally, she spotted a police car in the distance. Paul started dating Claudia when she turned 18. Paul was resourceful and made good money, but it was only after several years together that Claudia learned that Paul was in a gang. He never got his hands dirty, but was involved in kidnappings, extortion and intimidation. When the police got on their trail, criminal charges were filed against many of the gang members. For about a month they tried to negotiate with the police chief, but Paul knew that even if they were let go, they couldn't continue their previous lifestyle. They would inevitably get caught eventually, and Paul managed to secure his freedom by framing his accomplices and moving to the capital. The young couple, along with Sarah, rented an apartment. They were cautious to avoid attracting attention. Claudia secured a job as a secretary and performed well. Paul worked as a driver delivering goods to stores. A year later it was evident that Paul was not being pursued by his former accomplices, and he became more relaxed. "We can't live on our salaries if we want a normal life," Paul noted, "especially since your mum is unable to work due to her thyroid condition." "Paul, are you planning something risky? I almost lost you once," Claudia exclaimed in fear. "Why? There are so many people here, we're unlikely to be found, and if we're careful, I'm sure we can pull off something," replied Sarah, supporting Paul. Sarah had always dreamed of a luxurious life, picturing a 2-story house at the seaside, a fancy car, and foreign sanatoriums for her thyroid treatment. She was indifferent about who would make her dream a reality, so one day she suggested an idea. "Claudia, what if you got closer to your boss? Of course, he isn't a handsome man, but there is an advantage because he would be honoured to have a girl like you take interest in him," she proposed. "Mum, are you suggesting I have an affair with him? Are you out of your mind?" Sarah was shocked. "What's the big issue?" Her fiancé chimed in. "It's only for a few months. We'll figure out a way to rip him off, and then we can have a good life. We could buy a house at the sea and live comfortably." "But how can you even consider that? I will not sleep with him," Claudia protested. "Claudia, you wouldn't be doing this for fun, but for our future." Paul looked at her with a reproachful stare, and she obeyed. It took a year for the girl to earn her boss's trust. There was no relationship between them yet. Paul and Sarah had meticulously planned every step, but unexpectedly Curtis appeared on the stage. "What should I do with him now?" Claudia asked her boyfriend and mother when Curtis asked her out. "Claudia, you said he's not married." Sarah's eyes lit up. "What if you lure him in and marry him?" "That's too much," Claudia protested immediately. "I love only Paul. I don't need anyone else." "Claudia, we're not going to break up. I also love only you, and after this, we can finally get married officially. For the sake of our happiness, I agree to wait and tolerate," Paul added. After the wedding, Paul stayed in the apartment they rented, while Claudia and her mother moved in with Curtis. For several years they enjoyed life, spending Curtis's money on their needs. Paul bought a nice car, and after 3 years they had a large house in the suburbs. The initial plan was to divorce Curtis after extracting everything Claudia could from him. However, the more they got from him, the more they had an appetite. Sarah had become so accustomed to the role of a house mistress that she couldn't imagine herself without a maid, cook, and other helpers. Paul dressed in expensive clothes from high-end boutiques, and Claudia didn't deny herself any luxuries either. To avoid any suspicion, Paul suggested that she establish a charity fund, and most of the money she used to give to him. Besides, her work at the foundation provided her with ample spare time to spend with Paul. "So we need to decide what's next," Sarah asked one day. "Should we stop with Curtis, or—" She cast a cunning glance at her daughter and her lover. "Or?" Paul echoed her words. "Do you aim to eliminate him so that Claudia can inherit everything?" "That would be convenient, but the question is, how do we arrange it?" She sighed. "He's not a poor man. He can't simply vanish." "Well, if everything is arranged perfectly, no one will suspect anything," Paul reassured her. Claudia didn't like the whole idea too much. She would prefer to just divorce Curtis, even if he left her without anything. They still have already taken a lot from him. But when Curtis offered her to go somewhere for the weekend, in the woman's head a cunning plan immediately arose. Go-karting seemed to her a way out. Everything proceeded better than planned. However, Curtis did not die. He was left disabled. The schemers waited a few months to avoid suspicions about Curtis's fate. After nearly 6 months, they started devising a plan to finish what they had started. This time, they decided to present the case as if Curtis had been kidnapped, injected with a heart-stopping medication, and taken to the forest. His body was planned to be found ripped up by wolves. It was mid-March, and the hungry animals were prowling the forest in search of food. Everyone was so convinced of Curtis's demise that they were just waiting to find his bones. "Oh no! Mum, he's alive!" Claudia exclaimed in shock when she got the message from Curtis. With trembling hands, she called Paul. "I think no one suspected anything," he declared. "You spent the night at the hotel with Curtis. Then your mother had a heart attack and called you, which everyone saw. The EMT can confirm that. And you have that paid record from the clinic. And also, everyone saw you spending days and night near Sarah's bed at the clinic. Next, no one saw me there. It was already dark and I made sure the place was clear. The only potential problem was the cafe across the street from the hotel, but at that time it was closed. We wore masks. And none of us spoke. Plus, Curtis was most likely unconscious. The only thing I can't understand is how he survived. If his heart stopped, who brought him back to life?" Several days passed, and when Curtis did reveal his temporary hideout to Claudia, Paul immediately went after him. He had no trouble overpowering the defenceless Curtis. He led him to the basement of one of the abandoned buildings on the outskirts of the city and intended to finalize his plan the following night. "I think he won't last long in the cellar. Then we'll take him to the woods as planned. There, the wolves will finish our job." "And if he's still alive?" Curtis's wife asked in a frightened voice. "We'll take him there, alive," the man replied. "We'll leave him in the deepest part of the forest. This time it will be done properly." Curtis woke up in some dark place, lying on the floor, and felt damp. He tried to raise himself, but could not. After a while, his eyes got used to it, and he began to distinguish the walls. Apparently, it was a basement or some other underground room. Curtis felt the ground with his hands. Unable to feel his legs, he managed to lean against the wall. Who are these people? Who could have known where I was? Abby? Did she organize all this? Curtis's head throbbed with each question. Fear gripped his body as he considered the possibility. But then why would she save me? No, it couldn't have been Abby. Simon must have seen her at the factory and followed her. Or perhaps they're conspiring together. What are they going to do? Are they planning to blackmail Claudia? Claudia? She was supposed to visit me. Why didn't she come? Did I give her the wrong address? No, I told her everything right. Curtis felt the biting chill. His entire body shook from the cold. Why hasn't Claudia come? Where is she? Why didn't she save me? Suddenly a thought crashed into his consciousness like an explosive wave. Claudia knew my exact address. Could she have... Curtis froze at the implications of his thoughts. His thoughts seemed jumbled, but then clarity. My wife did this, he voiced aloud. She knew where I was. If Abby wanted to kill me, she could have taken me right here after the hospital. No one would have noticed my absence. Accepting this reality was difficult for Curtis. It meant that from the beginning, Claudia had been pretending. She had never loved him. The thought was so painful. Curtis felt as if his heart would burst from grief. Meanwhile, Abby ran towards the police car. She was so cold she could barely speak. Check that house. There's a big dog in the yard, the woman said in a trembling voice. I think they've hid him there. The policeman cautiously approached the abandoned house. Despite the dogs barking, one of them climbed over the fence out of the dog's reach. The other followed. 10 minutes later they came out, holding the ends of the blanket in their hands, with Curtis lying inside it as if on a stretcher. He was taken to the hospital again, and he and Abby testified for nearly 3 hours as the police recorded everything. Eventually they summed up. So it turns out that no one else knew about your whereabouts except your wife. The sergeant looked at Curtis. Abby also claims that she saw your wife with some man near the hotel and in the car that night. You know, we'll go back to that house. They're unlikely to appear during the day, but they'll be there in the evening or at night. We'll wait there. Please refrain from calling anyone until we have a better understanding of the situation. The police departed, leaving Curtis and his assistant alone. The man was filled with remorse. Abby, I'm sorry. This is all my fault, Curtis confessed. I initially lost my nerve and texted my wife. Then, while you were at the factory watching Simon, I phoned her and asked her to come. I suspected it was her from the start. The woman sighed. Thank goodness I found you. It's fortunate that I went directly to your house and trailed that car. You've already rescued me twice. Thank you. Tears streamed down Curtis's face. You were sent by God. It was wise of me to advocate for you with Sarah and keep you. I can't imagine what would have happened if I hadn't employed you back then. Abby looked at him. She too had endured much in these past days. She approached her employer and embraced him, prompting her own tears due to the stress. At midnight, a car pulled up to an abandoned house. Two men emerged, one of whom threw a piece of meat to quiet a barking dog. They made their way into the house, carefully descending into the cellar. Near the entrance, a flashlight was turned on, illuminating an empty room. Startled, Paul attempted to flee the scene, only to be met by 3 policemen. "Hands up," said one, pointing his gun. "Don't move. You won't escape." The Curtis case had been ongoing for months, and eventually Claudia, her mother and Paul were sentenced to different terms. After Curtis returned home, his life also began to change. The first thing the man realistically looked at was his health, and since there was no positive prognosis, the man decided to sell his factory after all. Simon and another employee bought it back in installments. "I am glad that my brainchild will belong to you," Curtis confessed to his former colleagues. "In your hands my factory will go up. I am sure that in a few years you will achieve much more than I once did." Despite the sadness of losing his enterprise, Curtis, after a few months, he sighed calmly. He had enough money for a long and prosperous life. But the most important thing that Curtis took out of this whole story was a reliable and loyal friend. He, as promised, fulfilled his promise. "Abby, what do you think of this picture?" The man stopped near the blue dancers. "What stunning colours! I adore this painting." Abby took Curtis's hand, their eyes drawn to the mesmerising figures of girls in blue dresses. No longer was Curtis merely her employer. He had become a friend and cherished companion. Yet Curtis hesitated to propose to Abby, fearing she would like to find someone better than a man with disability. One day he mustered the courage to express his affection. "Abby," Curtis began, "you mean so much to me, and I'm terrified of losing you." "I love you, Curtis," she replied with a smile. "Let's not complicate things. If I'm dear to you, let's not invent excuses to part." "I love you too. Will you marry me?" Curtis blurted out. "I'll answer right away. Yes," Abby laughed. They believed that their shared trials had strengthened their bond, and that no circumstances could pull them apart. Abby did everything possible to ensure Curtis never disconnected from life. They visited many places together, and when they welcomed a daughter, Curtis finally understood what it meant to have a family. "Disability only limits you when you let it," Curtis used to say. "I can confidently say that I have more opportunities than most people."